Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us.
Is the cloud safe? That's the question of the day. We're just going to dive right in today on this episode of Socializing Security. These are my favorite episodes. It's the ones where Brian and I did not plan sufficiently, and we'll just see how it goes. And I think, Brian, you like a more structured episode. Isn't that true?
That I am a structured person, yeah.
I feel like you do like a nice, to be fair, I would love to show you the back end ops of the podcast. It's a lot of spreadsheets and some really beautiful outlines. And I really vibe with it because I'm also quite type A, but like, Brian, I feel like you make me look type B, which I don't think I've ever had in my life, but I respect the heck out of it and also always want to meet you where you're at. But anyways, today, the question of the day is the cloud safe? So I'm just going to put it out there. Brian, what do you think? Is the cloud safe?
That's a big question with a lot of answers. The way I usually answer that is, there was a time frame when people would say, I'm not going to the cloud because it's somebody else's computer and I can't trust them. And at the time, I accepted that. Like, you have to feel comfortable with the infrastructure you're going to, and cloud was new back then and all that kind of stuff. Nowadays, though, I look at most of the companies that I have worked with in the past, maybe not so much as much currently, just because more enterprise customers that I deal with these days. I look at a lot of the customers I used to work with, the small regional hospitals, the school districts, the lower end of the mid-market, even up into the higher end of the mid-market. A lot of them don't have robust, mature security practices. And some of them may be running their own data centers. It may just be a building in their office. And I look at them and I say, will you be able to manage the security up to the operating system, let's say, because that's generally where the cloud, if you're talking infrastructure as a service, you're managing at least the operating systems, if not the virtual machines, and maybe a little bit below that. As you're managing below that level, are you more capable or less capable of a cloud provider? A full-time, they do nothing. They've got a massive team protecting hundreds, if not thousands, of other customers. Can you protect your infrastructure better than they can? And for most companies these days, the answer is probably no. They are going to not do as good as an infrastructure company, dedicated infrastructure company. Now, once you get above that, once you start talking about operating systems, applications, data, that's a little bit more on the customer, no matter where they're living at. So for all of the effort that needs to be put into running an infrastructure from the ground to the data and the interfaces, yeah, I think the cloud is safer than most people's on-premises infrastructure. Now, that's just, can you manage the security aspect of things? And is, of course, just the tops of the waves of answering the question. So it becomes you've got to decide at that point whether, do I want my data in the cloud? Usually for performance reasons, you may want to keep it on premises. If you absolutely need to make sure no one else has access to your data, regardless of how good you are at protecting it, you may want to keep it on premises. But for the most part, is the cloud safe? Yeah, I think for the most part it is. But of course, as we've talked about many, many times, people can screw up security. And they can screw up security on premises. They can screw it up in the cloud. So it's a matter of how well it's managed and maintained.
So from what I heard you say, in general, you believe, yes, the cloud is safe, and that you would rather, I don't know if gamble is the right word, but maybe gamble with your data in the cloud as opposed to on premises or on a server, on a computer, on a local machine, right? I think sometimes we use words that are on-prem, but a lot of people don't know what that means, where it's really talking about are we saying, is the file that you want to store on your local disk drive on your computer, is that safer there on your physical computer, or is it safer in Google Drive or in Microsoft, in like OneDrive, whatever cloud storage device you're using? So just as a synopsis is kind of yes, in general, because the security practices are probably better within the cloud than you as an individual, or you as, a medical professional, or, a small business that you're working with. The cloud might have better security tooling in place than you as a person or a small business, or, an on-premises server.
Yeah. And in both cases, it comes into trust but verify. I mean, you've got to understand what your capabilities are, what the cloud provider's capabilities are, make a decision based on that, and ensuring that between those two environments, deciding which is right for your data. And of course, there's nearly infinite permutations on how you can go about dealing with that cloud storage. Like, should you encrypt it before you send it out there? Do you store it encrypted while it's out there? All those types of things come into play, and those capabilities may be greater in the cloud than what you can do on premises. And yeah, on premises being in a location that you control from the ground up. That could be a colo facility where you've got the racks and all the infrastructure components.
Colo,
It
what is
could be
that? Using
co-location
so many
facility.
cool terms
Yeah.
today that I feel like so many people don't know.
Yeah, so co-location facility being somebody else's data center that you just rent space in, whether that be literal square footage that you can put a cage around to protect it, or you have your own rack of equipment that you're the only ones that have a key to that rack, maybe even in a cage as well.
I would share your view. In general, I would say, yes, I believe that the cloud is most likely safer than definitely like an on-premises, like local storage solution. That being said, my next question is always, which cloud?
Yeah.
Whose cloud? Because if we're just trusting a random app that you've like decided to store your data on like your iPhone, that's maybe not like one of the largest players, I'm not sure. Again, no hate or no judgment to the small fish in the pond, right? A lot of them are going above and beyond on compliance and security. It's just, we've talked about this before, security is super expensive, and like doing things really well is cost prohibitive, especially for startups, for small technology companies that are trying to store, process, download data, right? If we're talking about data storage, it can be safer to choose the larger players in this field, specifically with like your sensitive data. I think we've talked about this before, specifically on some prior episodes on the podcast, where we're really talking about like, okay, think about like your wedding photos, right? If we're saying that that's something that's like so sensitive that because you care about it, right? We never want to lose those family photos, or, something that is really meaningful to you. I think that's always a great way to like tie it back to the individual person and actually making sure that they care about that information is protected. There's a lot of data these days that a lot of us have just decided being like, yeah, we don't really care what happens to it, which is a whole separate episode. But that's one of our privacy series, I think. But I would say for me, it's very much which cloud is the question for me. So I'm like, yeah, for sure. If somebody's just generally asked me to be like, what would you feel like is more secure? Cloud storage or on-premises local data storage, I would probably say, yeah, the cloud storage most likely, because they're regulated differently based off of contractual requirements, international data transfer requirements, or we do have in the US, we have some like federal standards, as well as we have state-specific encryption standards. And then, yeah, the larger the player, the larger the regulatory landscape, which generally means the stricter the policies, the stricter the security controls. That's the talk in my world.
Yeah. One clarifying point coming out of what you just said is that we've talked cloud as a singular, but you've called out the fact there are a lot of different versions of cloud. There's also a lot of different types of cloud. And I'm leaning, the things I've said are leaning more towards the infrastructure as a service, where you can rent virtual machines. You can rent things like, hey, here's a storage location. I think the comments you're making lean a little bit more towards
SaaS.
more the SaaS world, where you're buying slices of software in the cloud. And this is what most people are going to be familiar with around, hey, I got a Microsoft 365. I'm going to store things in OneDrive. I'm going to
Can we take
Dropbox, those types of things.
Can we take a moment to just explain what is infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service at a high level? Because otherwise that could take up the whole episode. But just as what is IaaS? Is it PaaS? Is that what people call it? Platform as a service?
That's what I usually use. Yeah.
PaaS. Okay.
Yeah. So those are the three main types of cloud. There are many, many, many other versions of them. So at the most simple is going to be software as a service, and that the concept is those Microsoft 365s, your Dropboxes, even things like just the subscription services that you buy online and access through a web browser. That's most of the cloud people are consuming today. iCloud, another great example of a software as a service. In those situations, the management is usually very, very low for the company or the person consuming them. You're getting a very specific set of outcomes, a very specific set of services that you're getting. And so the cloud provider in those situations are managing pretty much the software on down, and you are mostly managing the configuration of the software, how it works, and or just the data. And so at that point, you're talking, they're managing the entire stack. Can they do all those things more securely than you can running your own Exchange server, email server? For example, my email is through a hosting provider that does a lot of different infrastructure type things, where I have a little bit more control over the email itself than somebody that's buying into 365 or using Gmail.
So you're not using like Yahoo or Hotmail or?
No, I think I finally killed my Yahoo.
I think those are retro now. Like somebody now who's like, oh, I have a Yahoo or a Hotmail. I'm like, good for you for holding on to it for this long. I'm like, I feel like those have come back again. I'm like, good for you. You've held on to the original internet.
We are in the 90s retro phase right now. So
is Netscape still a thing?
Not technically, no.
I'm taking us on a tangent.
You can see the history in some other products. But yeah, so I actually have more of a application as a service where like I get more of or maybe a platform as a service that maybe fits in better there, where I can manage that application stack itself, and I have more control than the average person would in Gmail.
Yeah.
Which then takes us to platform as a service, which is generally more in the developer side of things, where you've got a place to write code and execute code. And so it pretty much eliminates the infrastructure pieces, servers and network and storage and all those things, and just lets you create software. And so it's a platform with which to build software is generally there. So again, you're managing from the software layer up, and pretty much everything else is below that level at that point.
Yeah, and this is where on the platform as a service side, there starts to become some sharing of responsibilities of generally too, if the vendor, if the technology provider is offering this platform where developers can potentially execute code to build software as a service or applications, then from there, that's where there starts to become a lot of data ownership. Most likely the platform as a service provider probably isn't also an infrastructure as a service provider. They've outsourced that most likely. So they are building a platform, and their platform sits on top of infrastructure, maybe in like AWS or in Google Cloud or Oracle, some of the big ones where they've basically decided that that's like a shared responsibility model, where now we're kind of getting into like, is it infrastructure as a service, is it platform as a service? Is there a blend? Who's responsible for what? That's kind of where some of the compliance pieces start to get a little bit more interesting when we start to have these types of like crossovers, because most likely software as a service as well is probably potentially sitting on a platform and also sitting on infrastructure. So it's kind of like could be building blocks. I also just want to quickly say, when we're saying IaaS, PaaS, which I don't like, but IaaS, platform as a service, and SaaS, generally you will see those as like a capital I, lowercase a, capital S, capital P, lowercase a, capital S, and then again SaaS, capital S, lowercase a, capital S, just so that we're all talking the same language, where it's like IaaS, PaaS, SaaS. Just because I feel like I see those a lot just in mainstream news. I do read a lot of cybersecurity and technology news, so I'm not sure if it's very skewed, but I do also want to just take a minute to just like shed a light on if you're seeing capital S, lowercase a, capital S, SaaS, we're talking about software as a service.
Yeah, and you touched on the shared responsibility model, which is an important element of is the cloud safe, which is making sure you understand what is your responsibility, what is the cloud provider's responsibility, and where there may be some joint responsibility. So as we talk about these different types of cloud, the IaaS, the PaaS, the SaaS, that changes. So you end up with different levels of responsibility. So that's where I was kind of getting at with the email side of things. Like my email provider, I have more responsibility in that shared responsibility model than I do in my Gmail account
Is it
or my
Proton?
Yahoo
Who are
account.
you using?
I am not going to reveal that on this call, but I appreciate the question.
That's fair. You know what? It's great that Brian will push back occasionally if I go one step too far. But anyways,
Yeah.
I'm sure his email is relatively easy for us to find on the internet. So
It is. But that won't necessarily, well, I won't say that either. So having a very clear understanding of that responsibility model is a critical piece to answering is the cloud safe, because a lot of people, let's use the prototypical example here, which is Amazon AWS S3. It is object storage in the cloud. This is where if you download something from a website, there's a fairly good chance that file or that that document that you download is coming from an S3 bucket. And that's just the general term for this is that area storage. And you just throw a bunch of stuff into this bucket and they all have URLs with which to access them. And so that is an area that has gotten a bit of a bad name because of misunderstanding of the shared responsibility model. So the idea with the original, when S3 was first a thing, was that it was wide open. It was intended for you just dump things here and you point people to it and they can go download it. But then people started storing sensitive data like company secrets in there and customer data. And then somebody would figure out how to access that bucket and they would be able to pull the data out. And all of a sudden you had leaky buckets, pun intended. And that became a problem where people were like, oh, don't store your data. It's so much easier to get to. Well, assuming you configure it correctly, it is okay. And so having those buckets locked down in AWS has since made the default that they are locked down and not available for anybody, that you have that role-based authentication control to be able to say who can and can't access a thing in that bucket. And so it's important to understand that that is a shared responsibility of securing that bucket. AWS is going to secure the infrastructure and the platform that is S3. You are responsible for protecting your bucket and making sure no one can get into that unintentionally.
I am going to take us on a tangent just because for some reason S3 buckets and cloud storage buckets is something that comes up a lot in what I do as a compliance officer and security officer. It's just
for these reasons.
Yes, some of the most challenging points that I've had to weigh in on is how like storage bucket configurations, because they're often just like forgotten about sometimes in development, where a developer will be like, oh, really quickly, let me set up this cloud storage bucket and we'll point stuff to it. And then all of a sudden, somehow sensitive information is in this bucket and it's not properly secured. It maybe is even public facing, worst case scenario. But there have always been, like, from a security configuration perspective, I was just like, hey, like, let's just check in on the storage buckets. Let's make sure that we do a due diligence review, because sometimes they just seem to get neglected during security audits. I'm not totally sure
100%.
exactly why, but it's also really hard for people to even have an asset of all of their cloud storage buckets. But that ties into other conversations we've already had. But anyways, for some reason, when we're talking about S3 storage buckets specifically, and we're talking about, which I think is like a simple storage solution, is where the number 3 comes from, just because I was curious about it, because I kept being like, where is that 3 from? And I think it was because it was called a simple storage solution. So they're saying 3 S's. So
Yes.
I have a very specific image when people talk to me about cloud storage buckets and like S3 buckets, and it ties it back to SpongeBob for me, where I think about like the Chum Bucket or buckets of krill with like Squidward. And anyway, so if that is helpful for you, you can now think about SpongeBob anytime somebody talks about S3 cloud storage buckets, because that's where my brain goes to in the middle of an InfoSec audit. Somebody's like, oh yeah, and then our cloud storage buckets, and immediately I'm thinking about Plankton and SpongeBob.
It's an interesting connection to draw for sure. But yeah, definitely highlights the importance of asset management, knowing what you have, and the fact that, yes, if you misconfigure it, it's going to be a much bigger deal than if you misconfigured it on premises. And there are object storage technologies that exist for on premises. So yes, you could do that. That is a possibility. But it is still dependent on you configuring it properly to make sure it is secure, which of course could be a concern within your own infrastructure, especially if you're trying to get to zero trust and things like that. So yeah, it's important to understand that shared security model and the different types of clouds, and what responsibilities you would have to protect your information is super critical anytime you're picking a cloud.
Let's break that down, because I think you and I, just for those listening, Brian and I used to work together in an organization that did infrastructure as a service. So like that was our bread and butter. We were talking about cloud security, cloud storage all the time. That was really where we were really in the weeds. There's a lot of words that you and I definitely know just because of what we've done before in the past. When we're talking about cloud responsibility models, I think we can break it down a little bit more to make it a little clearer to those listening today who might be a little bit less technical or a little less specialized in cloud security than the two of us. If we think about just an end user via email, right? We've talked about kind of like how to secure your email. Also, shout out for you for setting a boundary earlier, because that also just shows, right? There's certain things that Brian probably has within his personal email account that he wants to make sure is staying safe, right? So in saying that, being like, hey, no, like I don't need people to know that. That's actually a really good privacy boundary that Brian said to me today, where he's like, hey, actually, I don't, because he's concerned, right, that somebody could then go try to do something malicious or nefarious with him, just like trying to actually like educate and explain how he secures his family's email, his family photos, whatever's in that, which is really important. When we talk about responsibility models, I kind of tune out at this because I'm usually like, yeah, okay, whatever. I say that right. And I'm actually responsible for creating cloud security models for clients and for companies I work with. And there's some really great ones. But when we talk about it from a personal perspective, if I, as the end user of, let's pick on an email, whether it's Office 365, Gmail, whatever, I am obligated to accept the terms of service, right, to even have this email. I usually have to probably accept like an acceptable use policy that I'm not going to use this email to, spoof or do malicious activity. And then I do usually have to create a password, a username and a password. And then sometimes there's an option to secure it further, right, with two-factor authentication. But as I'm an end user of Gmail, I'm required to create a username, a password to secure my account, accept the terms of service, and not use this system in a malicious way. Basically, use it in terms of the terms of service, right? Basically, use this email that I'm procuring from Google in this scenario to just send
Not
messages.
abuse it.
Yes. And those are my responsibilities. Maybe, I might need to clean up my email inbox if I want to maintain cloud storage without having to pay for extra storage. I might need to delete messages, but that's kind of it. And so again, correct me if you think I'm wrong on that one, but those are kind of the basic requirements for the end user of the system for this email. And those are that end users' responsibilities to be able to use Gmail. So some of those are just the responsibilities for the end user. And then within Google, they have the obligations to secure that information, to encrypt it, to make sure that there is cloud storage available for when you want to send those photos to your family via email and you want to send a quick send. And it would be really annoying, right, if it was like you're out of storage. So they have so many more requirements on their sides to making sure that your end user experience to just be able to happily use Gmail works. And so that's kind of where their responsibilities come in.
Yeah, and the security aspect of it is another layer altogether with a lot of the infrastructure stuff that you mentioned. So protecting the servers, protecting the data center, protecting the network, those all go into play. And again, depending on which variety of cloud you're in, IaaS, PaaS, and in this case, we're talking SaaS. SaaS again is the one where you usually have the least amount of responsibilities for security and infrastructure, because all you're doing is consuming an application. And that application is running on someone else's server. All that data is being stored on someone else's server, with a few exceptions. And so that's an area in which, as you pick a cloud, you need to make sure that whatever their terms of service are, whatever their responsibilities are, whatever their stated data protection guidelines are that they're going to follow, like all those things that Milu and people like Milu are writing, are important to understand as you're picking, should I go with vendor A or vendor B for this cloud storage solution, and understanding what the differences are. And if you're okay with that, that whole, I agree to the terms of service and I agree to the shared responsibilities. We joke about never reading those, but that's where you find those things at. And those are the things you need to look at to make sure you're comfortable with them.
Well, plus, I think what a lot of us as end users don't necessarily realize, and this is something that as I was really building a career in technology, I didn't necessarily think about, is when I'm signing up for something like Gmail, I'm kind of just as an end user being like, I am sharing my data with Google for email. And that's not necessarily what's happening anymore. It might have been a long time ago, like when, things were ramping up. But I think one of the conversations I'd like to have on an upcoming episode too is also like, what is the software vendor relationship and how does that work? So if I'm procuring, I just as an end user, I want to get an email, so I want to get a Gmail. What does that mean? Gmail is potentially the data controller. That's the lingo in my world, where that's kind of comes from like the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, where Google is the controller of that data, but then they probably have many sub-processors, which would be like additional software vendors that maybe they're using to like make the search functionality easier within Google, or, to process my consent record, or, to click the consent on that little checkbox that I signed in for the terms of service. Or maybe they're doing screen recording when I'm actually using it. Or maybe they now have artificial intelligence that's actually reading my emails. Google is a bad example because most of it's in-house, but a lot of the like other players are doing a lot of their own relationships with data sharing agreements. And so for me, I'm kind of thinking the next logical step for this conversation that I'm having with you all. And I think, Brian, you already had another primer for another conversation you want to do. So I think this is good. I think this inspired 2 future episodes. But for me, it's kind of, let's lay out, what does it mean to be a data controller versus a joint controller versus a sub-processor, if we talk about it in the terms of the GDPR, because it's kind of what set the standard for, honestly, most of the international data regulations, even in the US. Also, then there's another layer of like, what is a controlling entity under HIPAA versus a business associate. And we can kind of start to talk about what are those things at a high level, because it's really important. When I read the terms of service, one of the first sections that I look at as a consumer, as an end user of a product, is who is actually getting my data. So obviously, if I want Gmail, I can assume reasonably that Google is getting my data because they need to help me send my emails and to send those photos to my family. However, Google is most likely working with many software technology providers, and they are generally required to disclose that information because we have some very large international data standards in place, that it's just easier for them to disclose to everybody, being like, hey, yes, we use Salesforce, for example, for customer relationship management, and we use this tool and this and this and this. And that, I think, is maybe like a really good conversation for us to continue on a future episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a natural extension of this conversation for sure. But to answer your question, is the cloud safe? It's complex, the answer. And it does depend on which cloud you choose. But in general, if anybody comes up to me and says, I'm not going to go to the cloud because it's not secure, I'm going to call BS on that, because there absolutely are very secure ways to do business in the cloud. And some companies are cloud exclusive at this point. And, we hear about breaches all the time. Those breaches aren't always in the cloud.
I agree. If somebody were to ask me, is the cloud safe? I would say it's definitely safer than probably maintaining servers within your home environment, just because it's really hard to push patches on a regular basis, especially like it's also really expensive to maintain equipment. And, I feel like these days it's hard for us to all justify being like, oh, we need a new computer every 3 years. I feel like a couple of years ago, maybe that was more of the standard, but these days it's like, no, actually my technology needs to last longer. And sometimes it means that whatever you have within your home environment could be out of date just because it's end of life, because it's getting older. And it is really expensive to replace technology like hardware at the moment. So it actually might be less expensive for your family, for your friends, for your small business to actually rely on somebody with more firepower to build something more secure. And also, if they have additional customers, they're probably required to comply to higher security standards that actually benefit everybody.
Yeah.
I'm really always in the benefit of being like, what do they have? Are they GovCloud? Do they have FedRAMP? Do they have StateRAMP? Do they have these really intense, some of the US government standards, or, the EU, UK has similar ones. Australia has some of the best ones, but those are the ones I look at. When I'm looking for a vendor or provider specifically in cloud, I go to their compliance and security resource page to see what are their accolades, like who is buying their services. Is it healthcare professionals because they have super sensitive data? And so if they can handle PHI, maybe they could handle my photos.
Yep, totally. And there's an additional benefit of the DR side of things, being not strictly security, but adjacent, of saying, yeah, we're going to have our data offsite, so a fire in my house isn't going to take my pictures out. And the likelihood of a disaster happening in that data center is a lot less. Still very possible and something you should plan for, but that's another whole topic of discussion.
All right. With that, I think we can both summarize in saying that we do believe the cloud is safe. And we would love to continue socializing with you all on future episodes, as well as just, reach out to us. I think the best place is still LinkedIn for now. And thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Socializing Security.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.